The trial has been pushed to August 2026. If you listen to the noise, all you're going to hear is Durk is cooked. Nobody's there for Durk. Motion denied. But that's just the noise. The fact of the matter is his trial team has won a number of points in this case. The indictments, there's been 3 indictments, and each time the allegations against Durk have thinned out. Some of the evidence that they wanted to use has actually been withdrawn so that the judge didn't have to exclude it. I'm going to take you through it piece by piece. I'll leave the best parts for the end. First, when they charged Durk, the main allegation about him rapping in his lyrics was this lyric about him going, told me they got an Addy, got location, green light, seen your son on the news screaming, no, no. Okay.
Lil Durk murder trial. Lawyer destroys the feds over changing their story. You ever hear about a court case where 3 different stories are fighting to become the truth? Because right now the hip-hop world is watching one courtroom drama that insiders are calling one of the most confusing, explosive, and emotional trials rap culture has seen in years. And at the center of it all is one name everybody knows: Lil Durk. For months, headlines have been swirling around his ongoing legal battle. But what just happened inside that courtroom has fans, bloggers, and even legal analysts completely stunned, because during a tense hearing that sources say lasted nearly 4 hours, lawyers on both sides reportedly presented 3 completely different versions of the same case. 3 timelines, 3 explanations, 3 realities of what supposedly happened that night, and the craziest part, every side claims their version is the real one. According to people who were sitting inside the courtroom, emotions ran high almost immediately. At one point, a witness allegedly raised their voice. Attorneys interrupted each other. The judge reportedly had to bang the gavel more than once just to bring the room back under control. One court observer later told a hip-hop legal podcast something that sent shockwaves through social media. I've covered trials for years, yeah, but I've never seen 3 stories about the same event that were this different. Fans are shocked. Some believe the new arguments could completely change the direction of the case. Others think the conflicting timelines only raise more questions about what really happened behind the scenes. And then there's the detail that has people arguing all over the internet tonight, because according to courtroom insiders, one of the versions presented during the hearing reportedly includes a conversation that was never mentioned before. A conversation that allegedly took place hours before the incident at the center of the case. If that conversation is real, it could flip the narrative upside down, but if it isn't, then someone inside this courtroom might be playing a dangerous game with the truth. So how did this trial suddenly turn into 3 competing stories? And which version is the one the jury might actually believe? Because once you hear what each side is claiming happened, the situation gets even more complicated. The morning the courtroom doors opened, nobody expected the energy inside to feel this heavy. Reporters were already lined up outside before sunrise, bloggers refreshing their phones, fans gathering across social media spaces trying to catch any update about the case surrounding Lil Durk. But when the hearing finally began, what unfolded inside the courtroom didn't look like a normal legal battle. It looked like 3 different realities colliding in front of a judge. Witnesses later described the room as tense from the very first minute. Durk sat quietly beside his legal team, expression calm but serious, while prosecutors organized stacks of documents on the opposite side of the room. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but reporters sitting in the back rows could feel the tension building before anyone even spoke. And then the prosecutor stood up. What came next immediately grabbed everyone's attention. Instead of presenting a simple timeline of events, the prosecutor reportedly started by saying something that made several people in the courtroom look at each other. There are different stories circulating, he said, but today we're going to focus on what actually happened. The words hung in the air for a second, because the moment he said that, Durk's defense attorneys leaned forward in their seats like they already knew what was coming. The prosecutor then began laying out the first version of the case. The version his team believed explained the events that led to the incident at the center of the trial. According to this narrative, tensions had been building for weeks between several individuals connected to the situation. Messages exchanged between people in the circle allegedly showed rising frustration, misunderstandings, and accusations being thrown back and forth. The courtroom stayed quiet as the timeline was explained piece by piece. Phone calls, late night meetings, people moving between locations around the city. To prosecutors, all of it pointed toward one conclusion: that the situation wasn't random. They argued it was the result of a chain of decisions that slowly escalated into something serious. At one point, the prosecutor reportedly looked directly toward the defense table and said, this wasn't chaos, this was a sequence. That statement immediately triggered a reaction. Durk's lead attorney stood up before the prosecutor even finished the sentence. "With respect," the lawyer said firmly, "that's one interpretation." The judge quickly stepped in, reminding both sides to wait their turn. But the interruption had already shifted the mood of the room. You could feel the battle lines forming between the two narratives. Here, because the defense wasn't just planning to challenge the prosecution's timeline, they were preparing to introduce an entirely different one. When it was their turn to speak, Durk's attorney walked slowly to the center of the courtroom and placed both hands on the table in front of him. "What you just heard," he began calmly, "is one version of events." Then he paused. "But it is not the only one." That line alone made several reporters start typing on their laptops immediately. The defense began explaining their version of the story, a version that painted a completely different picture of what happened that night. Instead of a planned chain of actions, the defense argued that the situation unfolded unexpectedly, with misunderstandings piling on top of each other until things spiraled out of control. They emphasized confusion, conflicting messages, people reacting in the moment without fully understanding what was happening. At one point, the defense attorney said something that instantly caught the attention of everyone in the courtroom. "Sometimes," he said, "people build a story backwards after the fact." That statement hit hard, because what the defense was suggesting was that investigators might have taken scattered pieces of information and forced them into a narrative that looked organized, even if the real events were far messier. The judge listened carefully while both sides presented their opening explanations, but just when it seemed like the courtroom had settled into the usual back and forth of a major trial, the conversation took a sharp turn. A witness was called to the stand. At first, the questioning sounded routine. Basic details about where people were, who spoke to whom, and what was happening during the hours leading up to the incident. But then, the witness said something that made several people in the room shift in their seats. "There's another version of that night," the witness said quietly. The prosecutor frowned. The defense attorney raised his eyebrows. The judge leaned forward slightly. "What do you mean?" the prosecutor asked. The witness hesitated for a second before answering. "I mean, the way people are describing it now isn't how everyone remembers it." That comment landed like a spark in dry grass. Because suddenly the courtroom wasn't dealing with two competing stories anymore. There was a third one emerging, and this version didn't fully support either side. According to the witness, the conversations that happened earlier in the evening might not have been as intense as prosecutors suggested, but they also weren't as harmless as the defense implied. Instead, the witness described an atmosphere where tension existed, but nobody seemed to expect things would go as far as they eventually did. The witness even recalled a moment where someone reportedly said, "Let's just keep it cool tonight." That line caused quiet murmurs in the courtroom, because if someone really said that, it suggested people inside the situation were already aware of rising tension, something that could support both sides depending on how it was interpreted. Each of the prosecutor tried to push the witness for clearer answers. "Are you saying the events didn't happen the way investigators described them?" The witness shook their head slowly. "I'm saying it didn't feel like that at the time." The defense attorney jumped in immediately. "So the story being told now might not reflect the reality of that moment." Before the witness could answer, the prosecutor objected. The judge raised a hand, reminding both attorneys that the courtroom wasn't a debate stage. But the damage had already been done, because what everyone inside that room had just heard was the beginning of a third narrative, one that suggested the truth might sit somewhere between the two official stories. And that realization changed the entire atmosphere of the trial. Reporters rushed out during the first break to call their editors. Legal analysts started messaging each other, trying to interpret what the witness's statement meant. Online, fans were already debating clips from reporters describing the courtroom drama. Some believed the witness had just complicated the prosecution's argument. Others thought the defense might have accidentally opened the door to a version of events they couldn't fully control. Either way, one thing became clear that morning. This case wasn't going to be decided by a single simple story, because now the courtroom was facing three competing versions of the same night. And the deeper lawyers started digging into those timelines. The more contradictions began to appear. When the courtroom returned from the short break, the energy felt completely different. People who had been whispering quietly earlier were now leaning forward in their seats. Reporters had their pens ready, and even the judge seemed more alert, because once that witness hinted that there might be another interpretation of the events, the entire trial suddenly became something else. Wasted no time trying to regain control of the courtroom. The prosecutor was a master of the art of persuasion, and she knew exactly how to manipulate the jury. She had a plan, and she was going to execute it flawlessly. The prosecutor was a force to be reckoned with, and she was going to make sure that her client was found guilty. The prosecutor was a master of the art of persuasion, and she knew exactly how to manipulate the jury. She had a plan, and she was going to execute it flawlessly. The prosecutor was a force to be reckoned with, and she was going to make sure that her client was found guilty. The prosecutor was a master of the art of persuasion, and she knew exactly how to manipulate the jury. She had a plan, and she was going to execute it flawlessly. The prosecutor was a force to be reckoned with, and she was going to make sure that her client was found guilty. The prosecutor was a master of the art of persuasion, and she knew exactly how to manipulate the jury. She had a plan, and she was going to execute it flawlessly. The prosecutor was a force to be reckoned with, and she was going to make sure that her client was found guilty. The prosecutor was a master of the art of persuasion, and she knew exactly how to manipulate the jury. She had a plan, and she was going to execute it flawlessly. The prosecutor was a force to be reckoned with, and she was going to make sure that her client was found guilty. The prosecutor was a master of the art of persuasion, and she knew exactly how to manipulate the jury. She had a plan, and she was going to execute it flawlessly. The prosecutor was a force to be reckoned with, and she was going to make sure that her client was found guilty. The prosecutor was a master of the art of persuasion, and she knew exactly how to manipulate the jury. She had a plan, and she was going to execute it flawlessly. The prosecutor was a force to be reckoned with, and she was going to make sure that her client was found guilty. The prosecutor was a master of the art of persuasion, and she knew exactly how to manipulate the jury. She had a plan, and she was going to execute it flawlessly. The prosecutor was a force to be reckoned with, and she was going to make sure that her client was found guilty. The prosecutor was a master of the art of persuasion, and she knew exactly how to manipulate the jury. She had a plan, and she was going to execute it flawlessly. The prosecutor was a force to be reckoned with, and she was going to make sure that her client was found guilty. The prosecutor was a master of the art of persuasion, and she knew exactly how to manipulate the jury. She had a plan, and she was going to execute it flawlessly. The prosecutor was a force to be reckoned with, wasted no time trying to regain control of the narrative. He walked back to the center of the courtroom with a stack of documents and began presenting what he called the structured timeline. According to him, investigators spent months piecing together phone records, location data, and testimony from multiple individuals connected to the situation. Every call, every text message, every movement between locations had been mapped out carefully, and from the prosecution's perspective, that map told a clear story. They argued that earlier in the evening, several individuals had been communicating repeatedly, with messages that appeared calm at first, but gradually became more urgent. The prosecutor pointed to printed phone logs, explaining that certain calls happened within minutes of each other, suggesting coordination rather than coincidence. At one moment, he even turned toward the jury box and said firmly, "People don't make this many calls in this short amount of time unless something serious is unfolding." As the timeline continued to unfold, the prosecution suggested that the situation escalated step by step until the incident at the center of the case occurred. They described it like a domino effect, one decision leading to another until everything spiraled beyond control. Throughout the explanation, Lil Durk remained seated quietly beside his attorneys, occasionally whispering to them but otherwise showing little reaction. But the moment the prosecutor finished outlining that narrative, Durk's defense team stood up again, and this time their response came with a sharper edge. But one of the attorneys slowly approached the evidence board where the prosecution's timeline had been displayed. He studied it for a moment, then turned toward the courtroom. "This looks impressive," he said calmly, "but there's one problem." He pointed at the sequence of calls listed on the board. "You're assuming every call had the same meaning." The attorney began explaining that phone records only show when people communicated, not what those conversations actually contained. A call that appears suspicious on paper might simply be someone asking where their friend is, or confirming plans that have nothing to do with the alleged chain of events. The defense lawyer then made a statement that immediately caught everyone's attention. Context changes everything. He argued that when investigators built their timeline, they interpreted each call through the lens of the incident that happened later. But in reality, the people involved might have had entirely different reasons for communicating at the time. To drive the point home, the defense called another witness, someone who had spoken to individuals connected to the case earlier that evening. This witness described conversations that sounded far more casual than the prosecution suggested. Plans about meeting up, discussions about music and business, even jokes exchanged between friends. At one point, the witness recalled hearing someone say, "Relax. Nothing's happening tonight." That line instantly caused murmurs across the courtroom, because if that statement was accurate, it would directly challenge the idea that people were preparing for something serious. The prosecutor quickly jumped up for cross-examination, trying to highlight inconsistencies in the witness's memory. He asked precise questions about timing, locations, and whether the witness could truly remember every detail from that night. The questioning became intense, voices rising slightly as both sides tried to frame the testimony in their favor. Emotions ran high as the witness struggled to answer each question under pressure. "Are you certain that's exactly what was said?" the prosecutor asked sharply. The witness hesitated before responding. "It's what I remember hearing." The prosecutor leaned closer. "But you can't say it with absolute certainty?" That exchange left the courtroom buzzing again. Because suddenly the reliability of memory itself had become a key issue in the case. While lawyers debated the meaning of phone calls and conversations, something else was happening outside the courthouse. Fans were flooding social media with their own interpretations of the trial. Some believed the prosecution's structured timeline sounded convincing. Others felt the defense was successfully exposing gaps in the narrative. And then another unexpected moment happened inside the courtroom. During questioning, the defense introduced a detail that had barely been mentioned before, a conversation that reportedly took place hours before the incident between two people connected to the situation. According to the defense, that conversation suggested there were misunderstandings spreading among different groups, rumors being repeated and distorted as the night went on. One person thought someone else was angry, another believed a disagreement had already happened. But the defense argued that much of it might have been confusion rather than fact. "Information travels fast," the attorney explained, "but it doesn't always travel accurately." That idea added another layer of complexity to the case, because if misunderstandings were circulating that night, it could explain why people reacted the way they did later. Even if their assumptions were wrong, the prosecutor pushed back strongly against that theory. He argued that the amount of communication between individuals suggested something more deliberate. In his view, the phone records and witness statements still pointed toward a pattern of escalating actions rather than random confusion. At one point, the judge had to step in when both sides began speaking over each other, reminding them to keep the discussion focused on evidence rather than speculation. Still, the tension in the room kept rising. Because now the courtroom had heard three competing interpretations of the same events: the prosecution's structured timeline, the defense's argument about misunderstood communication, and the witness's earlier claim that the night didn't feel the way investigators were describing it. Three different lenses through which the same hours could be viewed. And as the day continued, even small details started to feel important. The timing of a single phone call, the tone of a text message. Warren dug into those details. The more it seemed that the deeper attorneys dug into those details, the more it seemed like every answer created two new questions. By the time the court session was nearing its end for the day, reporters in the back rows were already preparing headlines, because what they had witnessed wasn't a straightforward legal argument, it was a clash of narratives. As each side fighting to convince the courtroom that their interpretation of the same night was the one closest to the truth. And yet, as one legal observer whispered to a colleague while packing up his notes, the strangest thing about the trial wasn't the disagreement between the lawyers, it was the growing possibility that none of the three versions told the full story. As the trial moved deeper into the week, something unexpected started happening inside that courtroom. The tension that had already been building between the prosecution and the defense began spilling over into moments that felt less like legal procedure and more like a dramatic clash of perspectives. By now, everyone sitting in those wooden benches understood that this case wasn't just about evidence anymore. It had become a battle over which story the jury would believe. When the next hearing began, reporters noticed that Lil Durk appeared calmer than the chaos surrounding the case. He spoke quietly with his attorneys, occasionally nodding as they reviewed documents. But outside the courtroom, the pressure was growing. Fans were debating the case online non-stop. Some believed the prosecution's timeline proved there had been a chain of escalating decisions. Others argued the defense had exposed major gaps in that theory. Inside the courtroom, however, a new twist was about to complicate things even further. The prosecution called another witness, someone investigators described as a person who had been present during several conversations earlier that evening. As the witness walked to the stand, you could feel the room grow quieter, because by this point every testimony had the potential to either strengthen one version of events or completely disrupt it. The prosecutor began carefully. "Earlier that night," he asked, "did you notice tension between the people involved?" The witness thought for a moment before answering. "There was definitely some tension." That statement immediately caught everyone's attention. The prosecutor leaned forward. "Can you explain what you mean by tension?" The witness described a moment where voices became slightly louder during a discussion between several individuals. According to them, it wasn't a physical confrontation, but the tone of the conversation suggested frustration. The words were exchanged quickly, people talking over each other, the kind of moment where you could tell emotions were starting to rise. The prosecutor then asked the question that everyone in the room was waiting for. Did anyone mention the possibility of things escalating later that night? The witness hesitated, then said quietly, "Someone did say something like, 'This could turn into something bigger.'" That single sentence sent a ripple across the courtroom. Because if someone really predicted that things might escalate, it could support the prosecution's argument that the situation wasn't as random as the defense claimed. But just when it seemed like the testimony was strengthening the prosecutor's case, the defense attorney stood up for cross-examination, and his first question completely shifted the tone. "You said there was tension," the lawyer began, "but tension doesn't automatically mean something serious is going to happen. Someone say something earlier that evening about keeping things calm, didn't you?" The witness paused again. "Yes, I did." Now the defense lawyer turned toward the jury box. "So on one hand, someone mentioned things could get bigger," he said, "but on the other hand, someone else was trying to calm the situation." The witness agreed. "Yes." That moment created another layer of uncertainty because suddenly the conversation earlier that evening didn't sound like a clear sign of escalation. Instead, it sounded like a mix of emotions. Frustration from some people, caution from others. The defense attorney pressed further. "And at the time those words were spoken, did it feel like something dangerous was about to happen?" The witness shook their head. "No." It just felt like people arguing. That answer hit the courtroom like a quiet shockwave, because now the same conversation could be interpreted in two completely different ways. To the prosecution, it was a warning sign. To the defense, it was simply a disagreement between people who never expected things to go further. The judge eventually called for a short recess, but the tension inside the courthouse only grew during the break. Reporters rushed into the hallway to share updates with their editors. Legal analysts began debating whether the testimony helped or hurt either side. And outside, fans following the trial online were already arguing about what the witnesses' words really meant. Some believed the prosecution had shown there were signs of conflict earlier that night. Others believed the defense had proven that conflict didn't automatically lead to what happened later. Meanwhile, inside a quiet meeting room, Durk's legal team gathered around a table reviewing notes. One of the attorneys reportedly told a colleague, "Every version of this story is missing something." That comment captured the strange reality of the trial perfectly, because by this point, the courtroom had heard about phone calls that could be interpreted in multiple ways. Conversations that sounded tense, but not necessarily dangerous. Witnesses who remembered the night differently depending on their perspective. And now another detail began circulating among reporters covering the trial. According to someone familiar with the investigation, there was allegedly a moment earlier that evening where a misunderstanding between two groups may have played a bigger role than anyone realized. A message passed along incorrectly, a rumor repeated with slightly different wording. If that rumor really spread the way some people believed, it might explain why certain individuals reacted strongly later, even if the original information wasn't accurate. When court resumed after the break, the judge reminded both sides that the goal of the trial was to examine evidence carefully rather than build dramatic narratives. But by then, the reality was impossible to ignore. This case had turned into a puzzle where each piece could fit multiple ways depending on how you looked at it. The prosecution believed their timeline still pointed toward a deliberate chain of events. The defense argued that misunderstandings and assumptions had created a story that looked organized after the fact, and the witnesses themselves seemed to remember moments of tension mixed with attempts to calm things down. Three versions of the same night, each one containing fragments of truth, but none of them perfectly matching the others. As the courtroom session finally ended for the day, people slowly filed out into the hallway, still debating what they had just heard. One reporter turned to another and said quietly, "The strangest thing about this trial is that every story almost makes sense." The other reporter nodded. Almost. Because the more the lawyers dug into that night, the clearer it became that the truth might be buried somewhere between those competing narratives, a version of events that nobody had fully explained. By the time the trial reached its most intense stage, the courtroom no longer felt like a place where one clear story was being presented. Instead, it felt like a battleground of interpretations, each side carefully selecting details that supported their version of the night. The tension inside the room had grown so thick that even the smallest reaction, a raised eyebrow, a whispered comment between attorneys, seemed to carry weight. Observers later said you could almost feel the pressure building as everyone realized the outcome might depend on which narrative the jury ultimately believed. At the center of that storm sat Lil Durk, quietly listening while lawyers argued over timelines, motives, and memories. Some days he leaned forward speaking with his legal team. On other days, he simply watched the proceedings with a serious expression that revealed little about what he was thinking. But outside the courthouse, emotions ran high. Fans gathered on social media live streams debating every update. Families connected to people in the case reportedly followed the trial closely, and the public conversation grew more divided with each passing day. Inside the courtroom, the next twist arrived when the prosecution introduced what they described as a crucial piece of evidence. A series of communications investigators believed showed rising tension hours before the incident. The prosecutor walked slowly across the courtroom, holding a folder that reporters later described as one of the thickest stacks of documents presented so far. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the jury, "the context matters." He began explaining that the messages between certain individuals suggested frustration building over time. According to the prosecution's interpretation, what might look like ordinary conversation at first glance actually revealed a pattern, words becoming sharper, responses coming faster, the kind of exchange where emotions could escalate without anyone realizing how far things might go. At one point, the prosecutor read a short excerpt from one of those messages aloud. Even the exact wording was debated later, but the tone reportedly suggested impatience and distrust. As he finished reading, he turned slightly toward the jury and said, "When you look at this conversation alongside everything else that night, the pattern becomes clear." But the defense team was already preparing their response. The moment the prosecutor finished presenting those communications, Durk's attorney stood up with a slow, deliberate movement that seemed almost theatrical. He waited a second before speaking, letting the silence in the courtroom stretch just long enough for everyone to feel the tension. "What you're seeing," the defense lawyer said calmly, "is interpretation." He explained that messages taken out of their original context can easily sound more serious than they were intended to be. Tone is difficult to judge through text alone, and people often speak differently in private conversations than they would in public. To demonstrate his point, the defense attorney read another message from the same exchange, one that sounded far less confrontational. In fact, the wording suggested someone was trying to lighten the mood rather than escalate it. Sometimes, the attorney said, looking directly toward the jury, people joke with each other in ways that don't translate well when written down. That moment created another wave of murmurs across the courtroom, because once again, then came one of the most emotional one-times. Then came one of the most emotional moments of the entire trial. A family member connected to the case was called to testify. As the person walked to the stand, the atmosphere inside the courtroom shifted instantly. Observers later said the emotional weight of the moment could be felt throughout the room. When the witness began speaking about the events surrounding that night, their voice reportedly trembled slightly, and for a brief moment, even the attorneys seemed more careful with their questions. The witness described the fear and confusion that spread among people connected to the situation once news of the incident began circulating. Phones ringing non-stop, friends calling each other trying to understand what had happened, rumors spreading faster than anyone could confirm the truth. And now everyone was scared, the witness said quietly. The prosecutor asked if the witness believed the situation had been building towards something serious. The witness paused for a long moment before answering. It felt like people were worried, but nobody thought it would go that far. That statement immediately added another emotional layer to the trial. All because it suggested something many observers had already begun suspecting, that even those closest to the situation might not have expected the events to escalate the way they did. During cross-examination, the defense attorney gently asked the witness whether misunderstandings might have played a role in how people reacted that night. The witness nodded slowly. There were a lot of rumors, they said. Oh, people were hearing different things. Those words echoed a theme that had been appearing throughout the trial, with the idea that the story of that night might have been shaped by confusion as much as by facts. By the time the witness stepped down, the courtroom had heard testimony that seemed to support pieces of every narrative presented so far, evidence suggesting tension, messages that could be read as either serious or casual. Under witnesses recalling emotions but struggling to describe exact details. 3 versions of the same case were still standing. The prosecution's narrative of a chain of escalating actions, the defense's argument that misunderstandings and assumptions created a misleading story, and the witness perspective that described a night filled with confusion, fear, and conflicting information. As the judge prepared to end the session for the day, our reporters gathered their notes, knowing they had witnessed something unusual, a trial where every piece of evidence seemed to open multiple interpretations rather than closing the case. Outside the courthouse, the debate exploded again. Commentators argued over which narrative made the most sense. Fans posted long threads analyzing witness statements. Some believed the prosecution's timeline remained the strongest explanation, as in while others felt the defense had raised enough doubt to challenge that story completely. But perhaps the most unsettling realization came from a legal analyst who spoke to reporters as they left the building. This case, he said quietly, isn't just about proving what happened. He paused before adding one final thought. Oh, it's about deciding which version of the truth people are willing to believe. And now, the courtroom drama surrounding Lil Durk has reached a point where even legal experts are shaking their heads, because what started as a straightforward case has turned into something far more complicated. 3 different narratives, 3 different interpretations of the same night, and each one carries just enough evidence, just enough emotion, and just enough unanswered questions to keep everyone arguing about what really happened. On one side, prosecutors insist their timeline shows a chain of escalating decisions that led directly to the incident at the center of the trial. According to them, the calls, the messages, and the witness testimony all fit together like pieces of a puzzle. But on the other side, the defense argues that investigators built their story by looking backward, odd at connecting dots that may not actually belong together. They claim confusion, misunderstandings, and rumors spreading among people that night created a narrative that feels organized now, but may not reflect what people were thinking in the moment. And then there's that third perspective we heard inside the courtroom. Witnesses describing tension mixed with attempts to calm things down. Conversations that could mean one thing to one person and something completely different to another. A night where emotions ran high, people reacted quickly, and the truth may be more complicated than anyone expected. Fans are shocked. Families connected to the situation have been watching every development closely. Social media debates are raging, with people breaking down every detail of the testimony and asking the same question over and over again. Which version of the story will the jury believe? Now we want to hear from you. Do you think the prosecution's timeline is convincing? Or do you believe the defense when they say the story has been misunderstood from the beginning? And what about that third version that sits somewhere in the middle? Drop your opinion in the comments, because this is one of those cases where every detail matters, and the conversation is far from over. If you want more deep dives into the biggest courtroom dramas, hip-hop stories, and behind-the-scenes moments the headlines don't fully explain, make sure you like this video. You subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Because trust me, when the next courtroom update drops, the entire internet is going to be talking about it.